Berlin, 1955. A city sliced in half by invisible lines and armed checkpoints, where every shadow hid a watcher and every conversation carried the weight of survival or betrayal. In the rubble-strewn streets of this divided capital, the Central Intelligence Agency was waging a silent war unlike anything the world had seen before. A war fought not with tanks or bombers, but with cutouts, safehouses, brush passes, and the fragile loyalty of desperate men willing to sell their secrets for freedom, for money, or sometimes just for the promise that they would live to see another sunrise. This is the story of how one intelligence base became the beating heart of American espionage behind the Iron Curtain, where defectors were turned into weapons, double agents walked tightropes between death and deception, and every intelligence victory came soaked in paranoia, because in Berlin, you never really knew who was watching, who was listening, or who had already sold you out. When the Second World War ended in 1945, Berlin became a symbol of everything the Cold War would become, a city occupied by four powers, carved into sectors, and transformed almost overnight into the most dangerous chessboard in the world. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets each controlled a piece of the former Nazi capital, but trust dissolved faster than the ruins could be cleared. What had been a wartime alliance fractured into ideological warfare, and Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, became the only place in Europe where Western intelligence officers could physically touch the communist world without crossing an international border. For the CIA, that made Berlin Operations Base, known simply as BOB, the most critical posting in the entire agency. It was the front line. The place where intelligence officers could recruit Soviet soldiers, debrief refugees fleeing westward, run operations into the east, and if they were good enough or lucky enough, turn enemy officers into sources who would betray their own governments. But Bob did not start as a polished intelligence machine. When it was first established in 1945 under the Office of Strategic Services and later transitioned into the newly formed CIA, the base was a chaotic mess plagued by personnel shortages, inadequate funding, and even involvement in black market operations that nearly destroyed its credibility before it ever got started. The American military command in Berlin, led by General Lucius Clay, was initially hostile to intelligence work, fearing that aggressive espionage operations aimed at the Soviets might damage the fragile post-war relationship between the occupying powers. Clay wanted stability, not spy games. But as the Soviets tightened their grip on East Germany, closing borders, installing checkpoints, and transforming their occupation zone into a communist police state, even Clay came to realize that intelligence was not optional. By 1947, Bob was not just tolerated but essential, because without it, the Americans would be blind to what was happening just a few miles away across the sector lines. The city itself became a landscape of espionage. West Berlin was an island of capitalism and relative freedom surrounded by communist territory, and East Berlin was a fortress city where the Soviet KGB and the East German secret police, the Stasi, watched everything and everyone. Between these two halves ran invisible tripwires of surveillance, counter-surveillance, informants, and fear. CIA officers operated out of office buildings, embassy spaces, and safe houses scattered throughout the western sectors, but their targets, their sources, and their enemies were across the line in the east. To run an agent in East Berlin meant arranging clandestine meetings in bombed-out buildings, dead drops in public parks, or brush passes on crowded subway platforms where an envelope could change hands in a fraction of a second and disappear into the flow of commuters before anyone noticed. To recruit a defector meant convincing someone that the West would protect them, even though betrayal meant execution, and even though the KGB had eyes everywhere. The transformation of BOB from a struggling outpost into a formidable intelligence operation was driven by a handful of men whose names would become legendary in the secret world. Peter Sichel arrived in Berlin in October 1945, a young intelligence officer fluent in German, trained in wartime espionage, and tasked with building networks in a city that was still smoking from the war. Sichel had worked for the OSS during the war, recruiting German prisoners of war and turning them into agents who parachuted behind enemy lines to report on troop movements and military installations. Now, in Berlin, his mission was even more complex. To look after senior Germans who were feeding military, economic, and diplomatic intelligence to the Allies, to investigate Soviet nuclear capabilities, and to track both war criminals and scientists who needed protection from Russian capture. By December 1945, Sichel was temporarily heading BOB itself, managing operations out of the Henkel sparkling wine factory in Wiesbaden, a cover location that would have seemed absurd if it were not so effective. Sichel understood that intelligence in Berlin was not about dramatic shootouts or movie-style heroics. It was about patience, about building trust with sources who had every reason to suspect you, and about maintaining operational security in an environment where one mistake could burn an entire network. He also understood that the people fleeing westward, the refugees and displaced persons streaming into West Berlin from the Soviet zone and from Eastern European countries under communist control, represented an intelligence goldmine. These were people who had lived under Soviet occupation, who had seen military installations, who had overheard conversations, and who, if handled correctly, could be recruited to go back across the line and gather more information. Under Sichel's leadership, BOB began funneling promising refugees to activist groups, not just German organizations but also Eastern European and Russian émigré networks that the CIA supported and funded as part of its broader strategy to destabilize communist control and gather intelligence from behind the Iron Curtain. After Sichel came William K. Harvey, a larger-than-life figure who would become one of the most controversial and effective intelligence officers the CIA ever produced. Harvey took over BOB in the mid-1950s, and under his command the base expanded dramatically, reorganizing into separate sections that targeted East Germany, the Soviet satellite countries, the Soviet Union itself, and counter-espionage operations aimed at identifying and neutralizing KGB penetrations of Western intelligence. Harvey was obsessed with operational security, paranoid about moles, and willing to take risks that other officers considered reckless. He was also the driving force behind one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War, the Berlin Tunnel, a project that would tap Soviet communications on a scale never attempted before. But Harvey's BOB was not just about signals intelligence. It was also about human intelligence, about running agents, recruiting defectors, and penetrating enemy organizations through manipulation, coercion, and the careful exploitation of human weakness. David Murphy arrived as station chief in 1959, inheriting Harvey's expanded base and navigating one of the most dangerous periods in Cold War history. Murphy was in Berlin when the Soviets issued their infamous ultimatum demanding a resolution of the Berlin question, and he was the man advising President John F. Kennedy on how to respond when the East Germans began constructing the Berlin Wall in 1961, a concrete barrier that would divide the city for the next 3 decades. Murphy understood that the wall changed everything. It cut off the flow of refugees, made defection exponentially more dangerous, and forced BOB to adapt its tactics because agents could no longer simply walk across the sector line and disappear into West Berlin. Under Murphy, BOB became more focused on long-term penetrations, on running agents in place who could operate inside East German and Soviet institutions for years without detection, feeding intelligence back to the CIA through carefully constructed covert communication channels. Berlin's unique geography made it the most important recruitment center the CIA had during the Cold War. Refugees fleeing communist control did not have to cross heavily guarded international borders to reach the West. They could simply take a subway train from East Berlin to West Berlin, walk through a checkpoint, or slip across the sector line at one of the less monitored crossing points that existed before the wall went up in 1961. For the CIA, this created an opportunity that did not exist anywhere else, a steady stream of potential sources arriving voluntarily, desperate for help, and often willing to cooperate in exchange for resettlement, money, or protection. Bob officers and their support staff processed thousands of these refugees, conducting interviews, assessing their intelligence value, and identifying individuals who could be trained and sent back into the East to gather information, or who possessed knowledge about Soviet military capabilities, political developments, or the inner workings of communist security services. The recruitment process was both art and science. CIA officers had to determine quickly whether a refugee was genuine or a plant sent by the KGB to penetrate Western intelligence networks. They had to assess whether the individual had access to valuable information or could be positioned to gain such access. And they had to decide whether the person could be trusted, whether they had the psychological resilience to operate undercover in a hostile environment, and whether they would hold up under interrogation if they were caught. Some refugees were recruited as agents and sent back across the line with specific intelligence gathering missions. Others were directed toward émigré activist organizations that the CIA funded and controlled, groups like the Fighting Group Against Inhumanity, known by its German acronym KGU, which conducted propaganda operations, harassment campaigns, and intelligence collection inside East Germany. The Fighting Group Against Inhumanity was one of Bob's most controversial assets. Established in the early Cold War period, the KGU operated networks throughout East Germany, distributing anti-communist propaganda, sabotaging minor infrastructure, and gathering intelligence on political and military targets. By the mid-1950s, the organization had a central office staff of 10 more officers in field sectors, and 125 operatives running networks inside East Germany. These operatives received and circulated propaganda material and participated in harassment operations designed to destabilize the East German government and undermine Soviet control. The CIA funneled money and guidance to the KGU through BOB, but management controls were weak, and the organization operated with a degree of autonomy that made some agency officials nervous. The risk was that the KGU's aggressive tactics, particularly its harassment operations, could provoke a Soviet response or create a political crisis that would blow back on the United States. That fear became reality in 1953 when riots erupted across East Germany, a spontaneous uprising of workers and citizens protesting communist rule. The question of whether the CIA or its German assets had played a role in triggering the unrest became a matter of intense internal debate and external scrutiny. Bob had no existing project specifically aimed at stirring up trouble in the Eastern Zone, but the activist organizations it supported, particularly the Fighting Group Against Inhumanity, had harassment and destabilization as part of their mission. Whether the riots were purely organic or whether covert action had contributed to the conditions that made them possible remained unclear, but the incident highlighted the risks of using proxy groups whose activities could spiral beyond CIA control. By the late 1950s, the agency was already planning to shut down the KGU and similar organizations, in part because the West German government refused to take over responsibility for them, and in part because the Soviets had begun publicly denouncing Western espionage and propaganda operations conducted from Berlin, turning the covert groups into diplomatic liabilities. While Bob's human intelligence operations were expanding, the CIA and British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, were planning something far more ambitious, an operation that would intercept Soviet communications on a scale that seemed almost impossible. Berlin was the nerve center of a vast Soviet communications network that stretched from France deep into Russia and across Eastern Europe. Almost all Soviet military telephone and telegraph traffic between Moscow, Warsaw, and Bucharest was routed through Berlin over landlines, some strung overhead on poles and others buried underground in cable conduits. The Soviets had shifted from radio to landline communications for most military traffic, transmitting both encrypted messages and non-secure conversations that, if intercepted, could reveal everything from troop movements to strategic intentions. For the CIA, tapping into those cables represented the ultimate intelligence prize. But there was one enormous problem. The cables ran through East Berlin, one of the most heavily guarded cities in the world. The solution was Operation Gold, codenamed by the CIA, a joint effort to dig a tunnel from West Berlin under the sector line and into the Soviet zone, where the cables could be accessed and tapped without detection. In January 1954, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved the operation, and planning began in earnest. The CIA used a U.S. Air Force radar site and warehouse in West Berlin as cover for the construction work, telling anyone who asked that the buildings were part of routine military infrastructure. Beneath the warehouse, construction crews began digging a tunnel 1,476 feet long, extending from the American sector under the boundary line and into Soviet-controlled territory. The engineering challenges were immense. The tunnel had to be dug quietly to avoid detection, reinforced to prevent collapse, and equipped with sophisticated tapping equipment that could intercept multiple communication lines simultaneously. Bill Harvey, the chief of BOB, was ultimately responsible for the tunnel, which soon became known as Harvey's Hole. Harvey threw himself into the project, managing the logistics, coordinating with MI6 officers who provided critical intelligence on the cable locations based on their operations in Vienna, and overseeing the construction crews who worked around the clock in secrecy. By 1955, the tunnel was operational, and the tapping equipment was intercepting thousands of hours of Soviet communications every month. CIA analysts sifted through the material, translating intercepted conversations, decrypting coded messages when possible, and piecing together a picture of Soviet military capabilities, political intentions, and operational plans. For nearly a year, Operation Gold provided the CIA with an intelligence windfall that seemed too good to be true. It was too good to be true. What the CIA did not know, what almost no one in the agency knew, was that the operation had been compromised from the very beginning. George Blake, an MI6 officer who was secretly working for the KGB, had provided the Soviets with details about the Berlin Tunnel before construction even started. Blake's betrayal was one of the most damaging penetrations of Western intelligence during the Cold War, but the KGB made a calculated decision that would shape the course of the operation. Rather than shut down the tunnel immediately and expose the fact that they had a mole inside MI6, the Soviets allowed the tunnel to continue operating. They fed selective intelligence through the compromised lines, protecting their mole and gathering counterintelligence on Western activities, all while planning a theatrical discovery that would embarrass the CIA and turn a Western intelligence success into a propaganda spectacle. In April 1956, the Soviets staged an accidental discovery of the tunnel, announcing to the world that they had uncovered an audacious American espionage operation beneath Berlin. The revelation made headlines, and the Soviets used it to denounce Western spying and undermine the CIA's credibility. For the agency, the immediate reaction was confusion and frustration because the tunnel had been producing valuable intelligence, and its exposure meant the loss of a critical source. Only years later, after Blake's eventual detection and arrest, would the full extent of the betrayal become clear. Despite the compromise, historians consider the Berlin Tunnel one of the greatest intelligence successes of the Cold War because even though the KGB knew about it, the sheer volume of intercepted material provided insights that shaped American understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions during a critical period. The Blake betrayal was not an isolated incident. Berlin was a city where double agents thrived, where loyalty was a currency that could be bought, sold, and traded, and where the line between asset and enemy was often impossible to see until it was too late. The KGB conducted extensive surveillance on suspected CIA operatives, monitoring their movements, communications, and activities to gather information about Western intelligence operations. This was complemented by counter-surveillance measures designed to detect and thwart CIA surveillance of Soviet officers, creating a constant game of cat and mouse that defined daily life for intelligence officers on both sides. The atmosphere in Berlin was one of relentless tension and suspicion because everyone knew that penetrations were possible, that agents could be doubled, and that a single mistake could unravel years of work. One of the most damaging KGB penetrations involved Heinz Felfe, an officer in the West German intelligence service, the BND, who was secretly working for the Soviets. Felfe was more than a simple agent passing information to the other side. He became, in effect, a consultant to the KGB on operations in West Germany, advising his Soviet handlers on how to run deception operations, how to protect their own agents, and how to manipulate Western intelligence services into chasing false leads. Felfe's role went back to the early 1950s, and by the time he was assigned to the BND's counter-espionage group in 1954, he was perfectly positioned to cause maximum damage. The BND worked closely with the CIA, and a BND case officer was even placed inside the U.S. Army Berlin compound, working directly with BOB liaison officers. This arrangement, intended to improve cooperation and information sharing, instead gave Felfe and the KGB a window into American intelligence activities that they exploited for years. Felfe was eventually detected as a result of a lead provided by a CIA-run penetration of the Polish intelligence service, a reminder that espionage is a multi-layered game where breakthroughs often come from unexpected sources. But the damage was already done. Felfe had compromised operations, burned agents, and fed the KGB information that allowed them to run their own deception campaigns against the West. His case, like Blake's, underscored the fundamental problem that haunted Bob and every other Western intelligence base during the Cold War. You could never be entirely sure who was working for you and who was working against you. Every defector could be a plant. Every source could be controlled by the other side, and every piece of intelligence could be part of a larger deception designed to mislead, confuse, or provoke. The KGB was ruthless in exploiting this uncertainty. They ran false flag operations, presenting agents as defectors or opposition figures when in reality they were loyal Soviet officers tasked with feeding disinformation to the CIA. They used double agents to identify CIA officers, map out BOB's operational structure, and learn the agency's methods, priorities, and weaknesses. And they leveraged the constant threat of exposure to create a climate of paranoia within Western intelligence services, where officers spent as much time worrying about internal security as they did running operations against the Soviets. This paranoia was not irrational. It was justified by the reality that penetrations were real, that betrayals were happening, and that the cost of trusting the wrong person could be measured in blown operations, dead agents, and strategic failures. But here is the question. How do you run intelligence operations when you cannot trust anyone? How do you build networks, recruit sources, and gather secrets when the very act of reaching out to another human being carries the risk that they might be working for the other side? The CIA's answer in Berlin was to double down on tradecraft, to build layers of operational security, to use cutouts and intermediaries so that no single individual could compromise an entire network, and to verify, cross-checking every piece of information, every claim, and every source until patterns emerged that either confirmed reliability or exposed deception. It was exhausting, time-consuming, and imperfect, but it was the only way to operate in an environment where the enemy was always watching and always waiting for you to make a mistake. On August 13, 1961, the East German government, with Soviet backing, began constructing a physical barrier through the heart of Berlin. What started as barbed wire strung along the sector boundary would become a concrete wall fortified with guard towers, minefields, and kill zones designed to prevent anyone from crossing from east to west. The Berlin Wall changed the intelligence game overnight. The flood of refugees that had provided BOB with a steady stream of potential recruits and sources dried up almost immediately. Defection, which had been risky but possible, became exponentially more dangerous, requiring elaborate escape plans, forged documents, and the willingness to risk death in the attempt. For David Murphy, the CIA station chief in Berlin at the time, the wall represented both a strategic setback and an operational challenge that would define the remainder of his tenure. Murphy advised President Kennedy on how to respond to the wall's construction, balancing the need to demonstrate Western resolve against the risk of triggering a military confrontation that could spiral into full-scale war. Kennedy's decision to reinforce the American military presence in Berlin without directly challenging the wall's construction was controversial, but it reflected the grim reality that the United States could not prevent the Soviets from doing whatever they wanted inside their own occupation zone without risking a conflict that neither side truly wanted. For Bob, the wall meant that operations would have to become more sophisticated, more patient, and more focused on long-term penetrations rather than quick recruitment opportunities. Agents could no longer simply walk out of the East after completing a mission. They would have to stay in place, communicate through covert channels, and live double lives under the constant threat of exposure. The wall also forced the CIA to rethink its relationship with the German activist organizations it had been funding and supporting. The KGB and similar groups had relied on the porosity of the Berlin boundary to run operatives in and out of East Germany. With the wall in place, those operations became far more difficult and dangerous. At the same time, the Soviets were using the existence of these organizations as a propaganda weapon, denouncing Western espionage and sabotage conducted from Berlin and demanding that the United States shut down the covert groups as a precondition for any diplomatic resolution to the Berlin crisis. By 1959, even before the wall went up, the CIA had already decided to close out the fighting group against inhumanity and other similar entities, recognizing that they had become more of a liability than an asset. The shutdown process was completed in stages, with Bob officers working to extract operatives, secure sensitive materials, and wind down operations without leaving anyone exposed to Soviet retaliation. The wall stood for 28 years, a physical manifestation of the ideological divide that defined the Cold War. For the CIA officers who worked in Berlin during those decades, the wall was a daily reminder that the stakes were real, that the enemy was determined, and that the intelligence war they were fighting had consequences far beyond the collection of secrets. Every agent recruited, every piece of intelligence gathered, and every operation run against the Soviets or their East German allies was part of a larger struggle to understand the enemy's intentions, to identify threats before they materialized, and to provide policymakers in Washington with the information they needed to navigate a world where the margin between peace and nuclear annihilation was terrifyingly thin. Behind every successful intelligence operation, behind every defector turned, and every penetration achieved, there were human beings whose lives were shattered, whose identities were erased, and whose choices carried consequences that could never be undone. The CIA did not operate in a moral vacuum, but the nature of intelligence work in Berlin meant that officers were constantly making calculations that balanced strategic value against human cost. A refugee recruited to return to East Germany as an agent might gather valuable intelligence, but if caught, that person faced execution or disappearance into the Soviet Gulag system. A defector brought out of the East might provide insights into Soviet operations, but their family members left behind often paid the price through imprisonment, interrogation, or worse. These were the moral compromises that defined the secret war, and they weighed on the officers who made them even as they understood that the alternative, allowing the Soviets to operate unchecked, carried its own terrible costs. Peter Sickle, reflecting on his years in Berlin, spoke about the weight of those decisions, the knowledge that every recruitment, every operation, and every piece of intelligence came with risks that others would bear. He understood that the sources he ran, the agents he trained, and the defectors he debriefed were not abstract assets on an organizational chart, but real people with families, fears, and hopes that were often crushed by the machinery of espionage. Yet Sichel also understood that the intelligence gathered in Berlin had strategic value that extended far beyond any single operation, that it shaped American policy, informed military planning, and provided early warning of Soviet intentions that could mean the difference between peace and catastrophe. That knowledge did not erase the moral complexity, but it provided a framework for understanding why the work mattered and why men like Sichel chose to do it despite the costs. The KGB understood the human dimension of intelligence work and exploited it ruthlessly. They used family members as leverage, threatening to harm or arrest relatives of agents who cooperated with the West. They ran psychological operations designed to break down the morale of CIA officers, spreading rumors, planting false intelligence, and creating an atmosphere where trust was impossible and paranoia was the only rational response. And they recruited their own agents inside Western intelligence services, exploiting ideological commitment, financial desperation, or personal grievance to turn officers who had access to the most sensitive secrets. The result was a secret war fought not just with information, but with human emotion, manipulation, and the slow corrosion of identity that came from living a double life. What would you do if you were an intelligence officer in Berlin during the Cold War, knowing that every decision you made could cost someone their life, that every operation you ran could be compromised by a mole you did not know existed, and that the enemy was always one step ahead because they had penetrated your organization at a level you could not yet see? That question haunted Bob officers, and it drove them to be better, to be more careful, and to build the kind of operational security that could withstand betrayal even when it came from within. It also drove them to take risks that in hindsight seemed reckless, to push the boundaries of what was possible, and to pursue intelligence targets with a determination that bordered on obsession because they believed that the stakes justified the risks and that the alternative was surrender. If you've made it this far through this story, then you've seen what intelligence work really looked like during the Cold War. Not glamorous, not simple, but complex, morally ambiguous, and absolutely critical to the survival of the free world. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story we uncover. And here's a quick question I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the human cost of espionage operations like these was justified by the intelligence they produced? Or were there lines that should never have been crossed? Leave your answer below. Your perspective matters, and I read every comment. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Bob had been operating for more than 4 decades, making it one of the longest-running and most productive CIA stations in history. The intelligence gathered from Berlin shaped American understanding of Soviet military capabilities, political intentions, and strategic planning throughout the Cold War. Operations like the Berlin Tunnel provided insights that informed U.S. policy at the highest levels, giving presidents and military commanders a clearer picture of what the Soviets were capable of and what they intended to do. The defectors recruited and debriefed by BOB officers revealed the inner workings of Soviet intelligence services, exposed penetrations of Western organizations, and provided leads that led to the arrest of double agents like Heinz Felfe and George Blake. And the networks built and run by CIA officers in Berlin extended deep into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself, creating a web of sources that provided early warning of political developments, military movements, and strategic shifts. But the legacy of BOB is more complex than a simple catalog of successes. The activist organizations the CIA supported, like the Fighting Group Against Inhumanity, conducted operations that blurred the line between intelligence collection and covert action, raising questions about whether the agency was simply gathering information or actively attempting to destabilize communist governments. The 1953 riots in East Germany, whether or not the CIA played a direct role in triggering them, illustrated the risks of using proxy groups whose activities could spiral beyond control and create diplomatic crises that undermined broader American policy goals. And the penetrations of Western intelligence by officers like Blake and Felfe demonstrated that even the most sophisticated operational security could be defeated by a single well-placed mole, a lesson that intelligence services are still grappling with today. David Murphy, who became chief of the CIA's Soviet-Russia Operations Division after his time in Berlin, carried the lessons of BOB with him for the rest of his career. He understood that intelligence work was not about dramatic victories, but about patience, persistence, and the slow accumulation of insights that over time created a picture clear enough to guide policy. He also understood that the enemy was adaptable, ruthless, and always learning, that the KGB studied American methods just as carefully as the CIA studied Soviet operations, and that every success could be reversed by a single betrayal or a shift in the strategic environment. Murphy's tenure in Berlin, particularly his experience advising President Kennedy during the construction of the wall, shaped his understanding of how intelligence and policy intersect, how the information gathered by officers in the field influences decisions made by leaders in Washington, and how the quality of that intelligence can mean the difference between war and peace. Peter Sickle returned to Washington after his time in Berlin and eventually left the CIA to pursue a career in the wine business. But he never forgot the years he spent running operations in the divided city. In interviews conducted decades later, he spoke about the tunnel, the defectors, the moral compromises, and the sense that he and his colleagues were part of something larger than themselves, a struggle to defend freedom against an ideology that sought to extinguish it. Sichel's reflections captured the duality of intelligence work during the Cold War, the pride in having contributed to something important balanced against the knowledge that the methods used were morally ambiguous and that the human cost was often devastating. He remained convinced that the work mattered, that the intelligence gathered in Berlin helped prevent a Third World War, and that the sacrifices made by agents, officers, and defectors were not in vain. The story of CIA Berlin Operations Base raises questions that extend far beyond the Cold War and remain relevant today. How do democratic societies balance the need for intelligence collection against the moral and ethical implications of espionage operations that involve deception, manipulation, and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals? How do intelligence services build and maintain trust with sources in an environment where betrayal is always possible and where the enemy is actively working to penetrate your organization? And how do policymakers use the intelligence they receive to make decisions that shape the course of history, knowing that the information may be incomplete, compromised, or deliberately misleading? Berlin was a laboratory for answering these questions, a place where the CIA experimented with tactics and strategies that would later be applied in other theaters of the Cold War and in the conflicts that followed. The tradecraft developed in Berlin, the use of safehouses, cutouts, brush passes, and covert communication methods became standard practice for intelligence officers operating in hostile environments around the world. The lessons learned from penetrations like Blake and Felfy shaped how the CIA approached counterintelligence, leading to more rigorous vetting procedures, more sophisticated internal security measures, and a recognition that the threat from within could be just as dangerous as the threat from outside. And the experience of running long-term agents in place, operatives who lived double lives for years or even decades, informed the CIA's approach to human intelligence collection in an era when signals intelligence and satellite reconnaissance were becoming dominant. The Berlin Tunnel, despite being compromised from the start, demonstrated the value of technical intelligence operations and the importance of taking calculated risks even when success is uncertain. The fact that the Soviets allowed the tunnel to operate for nearly a year, even though they knew about it, speaks to the complexity of the intelligence game and the ways in which even compromised operations can produce valuable insights. The tunnel also illustrated the importance of operational security and the catastrophic consequences of penetrations, because Blake's betrayal not only compromised the tunnel, but also exposed other Western intelligence operations and led to the deaths of agents who trusted that their identities were protected. The lessons of the tunnel, both the successes and the failures, continue to shape how intelligence agencies approach technical collection and how they assess the risks of penetration. The human dimension of intelligence work, the moral compromises, the psychological toll on officers and agents, and the cost borne by individuals caught between competing powers remains one of the most difficult aspects of the secret war to reckon with. The CIA officers who worked in Berlin were not cartoon villains or unthinking automatons. They were men and women who believed they were defending their country, who made difficult decisions under enormous pressure, and who lived with the consequences of those decisions for the rest of their lives. The agents they recruited, the defectors they debriefed, and the sources they ran were also human beings, people who made choices based on fear, hope, greed, or ideology, and who often paid a terrible price for those choices. Understanding this human dimension is essential to understanding the Cold War, because the secret war was not fought with abstract strategies or impersonal technologies, but with real people whose lives were shaped and often destroyed by the conflict. When the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, it marked the end of an era not just for the city, but for the entire intelligence community. The wall, which had stood as the most visible symbol of the Cold War for 28 years, was dismantled piece by crowds of Berliners who had lived their entire lives in its shadow. For the CIA officers who had operated in Berlin during the decades of division, the fall of the wall was both a triumph and a moment of profound reflection. The intelligence they had gathered, the operations they had run, and the risks they had taken had contributed to the broader strategy of containment that ultimately succeeded in exhausting the Soviet Union and bringing about the collapse of communist control in Eastern Europe. But the victory was bittersweet, because it came at a cost measured in lives destroyed, families torn apart, and individuals betrayed by the very systems that had promised to protect them. Bob itself evolved after the Cold War ended, shifting its focus from countering Soviet intelligence to addressing new threats, from terrorism to nuclear proliferation to the rise of new adversaries. But the institutional knowledge built during the Cold War, the understanding of how to run operations in a hostile environment, how to recruit and manage agents, and how to balance strategic objectives against moral constraints, remained a core part of the CIA's identity. The officers who had worked in Berlin went on to train the next generation of intelligence professionals, passing down the lessons they had learned and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. And the stories of the Cold War, the operations, the betrayals, and the triumphs became part of the agency's collective memory, a reminder of what had been at stake and why the work mattered. The city of Berlin, reunified after decades of division, became a symbol of the peaceful resolution of the Cold War, a place where the ideological struggle between East and West ended not in nuclear annihilation, but in the triumph of freedom and democracy. But for those who had lived through the years of division, the scars remained. The families separated by the wall, the individuals who died trying to cross it, and the countless people whose lives were shaped by the intelligence war fought in the shadows, all carried the weight of that history. The legacy of BOB is inseparable from that history, a reminder that intelligence operations, no matter how successful or how necessary, come with a human cost that cannot be ignored or forgotten. Berlin Operations Base was more than just a CIA station. It was the front line of the Cold War's secret war, a place where intelligence officers waged a relentless campaign to penetrate Soviet and East German defenses, recruit defectors, run double agents, and gather the information that shaped American policy for 4 decades. The operations conducted by BOB, from the audacious Berlin Tunnel to the complex recruitment networks that funneled refugees into intelligence assets, demonstrated the CIA's willingness to take risks, to innovate, and to push the boundaries of what was possible in the pursuit of strategic advantage. But those operations also exposed the vulnerabilities of Western intelligence, the ever-present threat of penetration, and the moral complexities inherent in a secret war where victory was measured not in battles won, but in secrets stolen and lives manipulated. The men who led BOB, Peter Sickle, William Harvey, David Murphy, and countless others whose names remain classified, understood that intelligence work in Berlin was not about glory or recognition, but about the slow, patient accumulation of insights that over time could prevent catastrophe. They built an organization that survived betrayals, adapted to shifting strategic realities, and continued to operate effectively even as the KGB worked tirelessly to destroy it. The agents they recruited, the defectors they protected, and the sources they ran operated under constant threat of exposure and death, driven by motives that ranged from ideological conviction to simple survival. And the intelligence they produced, despite the compromises and the costs, gave American leaders the information they needed to navigate the most dangerous period in modern history without triggering the war that everyone feared. The legacy of Berlin Operations Base is a testament to the power of human intelligence, the importance of tradecraft, and the enduring reality that in a world of competing powers, information is the ultimate weapon. It is also a reminder that intelligence work comes with a moral weight that cannot be avoided, that every operation has consequences, and that the decisions made in the shadows of divided cities like Berlin ripple outward in ways that shape the lives of millions. The Cold War is over, the wall has fallen, and Berlin is now a unified city, but the lessons learned during those decades of division remain as relevant today as they were when Peter Sichel first arrived in the ruins of the defeated Nazi capital in 1945. The secret war never truly ends. It simply changes shape, adapts to new threats, and continues in the shadows where intelligence officers still operate, still take risks, and still make the difficult choices that come with defending a free society in a dangerous world.